Much of the continental United States is rapidly desertifying. One of the hottest, driest areas in the United States is the Salton Sea, Imperial Valley area just east of Los Angeles. On the hottest days, this area can blow hot, dry winds toward Los Angeles, causing record heat and causing hospitalization and death. My guest, Rodger Savory, says he can solve this problem. Let's listen to what he has to say. Rodger Savory is an ecologist who is focused on turning deserts into grasslands. Rodger is director of Savory Holistic, which utilizes livestock to turn deserts into grasslands that have a positive impact on the climate, water quality, and wildlife. He's now proposing to restore a desert in Southern California, and we'll be talking about his hopes for this project. Rodger, how are you today?
I'm good. Even when I'm bad, I'm good. Thanks for asking.
Hey, what's your secret? Tell me your secret.
Positive mental attitude.
There we go. Rodger, you've turned deserts into grasslands all over the world, including Africa, Australia, and North America. Now you propose to create a grassland from a desert in Southern California. What would you like for people to know about your proposed project?
Thanks for having me on, and thanks for asking the question. I think primarily the reason I chose the Salton Sea area is I actually looked for the worst spot that I could find in America. And the Imperial Valley and Salton Sea is basically the worst spot. It's got one of the lowest rainfalls in the country, one of the hottest heat indexes. It's got huge dust storms. I think the local native population in the area, I think their children have about 30% asthma rate. So I really wanted to find the worst of the worst, because if we can work with people and show people that these principles work in the worst of the worst, then I'm hoping that will diffuse many arguments of humans always look for excuses as to why they can't do something. When I first brought these ideas from Africa back to America, everyone said, "Oh, that'll work in Africa, it won't work here for this reason." Then I went up to Canada. "Oh, that'll work in America, it won't work here for this reason." Then I went to Australia, and "Oh, that'll work there, but it won't work here because we only have arthropods." Humans always look for excuses as to why something won't work. I don't know what it is about us. So I wanted to find the worst of the worst that I can find of the 800 million acres of desert in America currently. Because if we can work with communities and show people, well, this works here, then it will be much more difficult for pushback to gain traction and for us to waste more years in disbelief.
Rodger, your organization is in competition for the Carbon X Prize. According to the Carbon X Prize website, this 4-year global competition invites innovators to create and demonstrate solutions that can pull carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere. What motivated you to enter this competition, and why do you think your team has a serious chance of winning?
So firstly, just my sense of humor. If you look at when I entered our team, Deserts to Grasslands, Feeding the Future, it's at 23:59 is when we entered, as in 1 minute before the deadline for entry. Now, the reason it was entered 1 minute before the deadline for entry, even though they gave about 3 months of lead up time, was because I was desperately hoping that someone else would enter. And nobody put their hand up, and all over the world, I mean, we've got tens of thousands of people who practice and manage holistically. We've got huge institutions. We've got the Savory Institute. We've got Holistic Management International. We've got these global organizations, and I was hoping that they would stick their hand up because they have been teaching and showing people that just by managing holistically, harnessing the power of nature, getting the solar energy flow from solar energy to plants grown to food produced. They have been sequestering carbon globally for many years. So anyone in the know knows that it works. So I was waiting for someone in the know to enter a team, and no one did. So finally, I entered a team. And as soon as I'd done that and posted it on Facebook, everyone said, "Oh, great, wonderful, thanks, fantastic. We were waiting for someone to do it." So it was one of those situations of no one wanted to put their hand up. And so I drew the short straw and put my hand up. And there's an old saying, be careful what you wish for one day you shall receive it.
Right. It's interesting that there was no competition among the people who believe that this is the best solution for drawing down carbon. Rodger, you've lived on a mountain range that stands between Los Angeles and the Imperial Valley. You've seen it rain on one side, but not the other. What's going on there?
So basically physics. So we've got a situation where the cool air comes off the ocean, and it comes on shore and it creates clouds and rainfall conditions. And then in the Imperial Valley, from mountain range to mountain range, we've got this huge bare rock sand, just this huge bare area that's just baking. So, for example, if you've got soil covered with mulch, the ground temperature might be about 80 or 90 degrees. But at the same time that where there's mulch, it might be 80 or 90 degrees, we find temperatures in excess of 140 degrees on rock. I mean, I don't need to teach you this. Anyone can go and walk outside and stand on the hot tarmac or hot concrete and burn their feet. But if they stand on the lawn, they're not going to burn their feet. So we've got this massive area of millions of acres like that. Now, from the Imperial Valley up towards the mountains, towards Julian and Riverside and all of the California coastal area, it's a very steep, almost vertical cliff face. Now, what that means is we all know hot air rises. But when you've got this hot air from the valley that's been supercharged and superheated by the sun, and now it has only one option, and that's to rise, it will naturally rise up towards the cliff faces, and those cliff faces are all solid rock. From the valley to the mountaintop is solid rock. There's no vegetation. Well, I say no, hardly any vegetation. And so it's being heated even as it's going up. So now you get these jet blasters of hot air blowing vertically, and the clouds hit that jet blaster and they have no option but to evaporate. Mm-hmm. So when they evaporate, no rain comes over. And so it's a vicious cycle. Because it's hot in the valley, no rain can fall. Mm-hmm. Because no rain can fall, it's hot in the valley. So we have to think about, how do we break that cycle? How do we get the ground cooler so that we don't have that extreme heat blowing vertically, pushing the clouds back, and ultimately when the big winds come, it blows vertically and it blows over and it blows into the cities along the coast. So and historical records show that it didn't used to be like that. There's pollen records and stuff showing that there was a lot of vegetation and a lot of different vegetation in the area. So we know that this is basically a human-created desert, and not necessarily by Western humans. It could have been much earlier humans that created the desert.
Well, let's say you're charged with the management of a tract of land that is, for example, 5,000 acres. This 5,000 acres is currently desert land, and you're going to turn it into a grassland. What do you do first and then next?
So first, you bring everybody involved, all stakers involved, in for a discussion about how do we want our lives to be. And if we want to live in a desert, well, then we say, great, and we leave. However, if people say, no, we'd actually like to have biodiversity, and we'd like to be able to feed our families, and we'd like clear flowing streams, and we wouldn't like dust in the air, and we'd like healthy air. And if we describe, a a biodiverse region with plants and ground cover, and basically a healthy ecosystem, then we will begin to make management decisions towards achieving it. Now, for the biological carpeting process, the first bit of that would be contracts with the farmers to the north and south of the Salton Sea for them to grow a very biodiverse forage mix to feed livestock with. And then the second part would be sourcing the livestock to put on the property, getting we need some technology. We need shade cloth with misters and what I call portable eggmobile umbrellas to keep the livestock cool in the heat of the sun, because it is ridiculously hot out there. And then we need the chickens to scratch the dung to keep all the maggots and flies out. So they're part of the system. And then the misting just generally cools the ambient air temperature. And then once we've got all that infrastructure in place, then we literally just start cutting the forage that we've grown from the farmers, having it delivered to the cattle, and we literally just feed them in the desert. But we feed them in the desert in a special way, feed them, water them, so that they're always kind of just gently moving forward, and so that we don't get a CAFO type of situation. Anything is poisonous if you have too much of it, but can be very beneficial if you have just the right amount. So over about 30 years, I've figured out what's just the right amount of dung and urine on the soil to shield and protect the soil from ultraviolet light and begin that process of healing the desert.
So do you sow the seed mix first and then the cattle come in later? You don't like run the cattle and then sow and fertilize and then sow the seeds?
No, it's two different operations. Okay. So the food is grown for the cattle. Then the cattle have to eat it. We don't actually care. Well, we do because we want good, healthy cattle. But what we really care about for turning a desert back into a grassland is the 4 hooves and 1 dung producer that each animal has. Those are the key ingredients. The hooves are needed to break up the crusting. Much of the desert has a 4 to 6 inch crust, and it's like concrete. So we've got to break that up. We've got to get organic matter mixed into it, and then we've got to get it shielded from the sunlight so that the mycelium and fungi can start doing their magic. Only once we can have healthy fungi networks below ground, only then can life start returning and regenerate. So we have to create the conditions for fungi to benefit. And we all know mushrooms grow warm, wet, and dark. Well, a desert is not wet, it's not warm, it's extremely hot, and it's not dark, it's bright and sunny. So we have to create warm, wet, and dark, and then the life cycle can begin.
So over the course of the first and second year, what could people expect to see?
Either amazing results or nothing at all. And now the reason I say that is because once we've laid the biological carpet down, then we have to wait for rainfall. Now, we could wait 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years for rainfall. Or like this year, it rained. I mean, it just rained buckets. I think they got 4 inches a couple of weeks ago. So we have to get the carpet down first, and then wait for rainfall. Now, the worst droughts in California, we've always had at least some rainfall. There's never been a totally dry year, but it's nature. We're dealing with nature. Now, what I do expect is because we've got the carpet laid down, at 5,000 acres, we're not really going to have an impact. But when people see that it's working and government gives us permission to do it on a bigger scale, and the community and the society and the nation asks us to do it on a bigger scale, we can easily do about 150,000 acres a year. And a decade later, we'd have 1.5 million acres of cooled ground. At that point, I expect to see significant weather pattern changes. The research from around the world shows that 150,000 acres, we do start to see weather pattern changes. So, and we can do that in 1 year if we have permission to do it. Financially, it works very well to do 150,000 acres a year.
So, as part of your process of turning deserts into grasslands, you propose to create a biological carpet. That's an interesting term. What is the biological carpet, and why is that something you want to create?
So, the biological carpet is a term I coined to describe what conditions we need to jumpstart life cycles. I didn't realize it for a long time. The penny didn't drop. But when I was analyzing why, when we did biological carpeting, sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't work, it wasn't until we made the discovery that ultraviolet light was the enemy. And we had to totally stop ultraviolet light. And that was connected to learning that bacteria form in layers in the soil. And the bacteria that live in the top, and the fungi that live in the top millimeter of soil only live in the top millimeter of soil. The ones that live in the second millimeter only live in the second millimeter, and you can keep on going down the profile. So we didn't understand that. Once we understood that, we realized, oh, without getting the top millimeter fixed, we can't fix the next and the next. But ultraviolet light was killing the microorganisms in the top millimeter. So the biological carpet is literally, we've just got to get a carpet of life that is thick enough to completely block ultraviolet light. And when we get that, then the life can start in that top millimeter, and that triggers the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth. And it's the bacteria fungi combination. The fungi tap on a seed that's in the soil, and when they tap on the seed, then the seed knows it can germinate. If the signal doesn't come from the mycelium to germinate, the plant will just lie there waiting. And we've found seeds in soil that are 2,600 years old. That means for 2,600 years, they didn't find the right conditions to germinate. However, when we gave them the right conditions to germinate in a lab, they germinated and plants started growing. So it really shows that the plants can wait an extraordinary length of time for the right conditions to germinate, and when the right conditions come, they germinate. I was just talking to a rancher in the Chihuahuan Desert in Mexico this morning, and he's gone from 3 species of perennial grasses on his ranch to he's up to 50 new unknown perennial grasses growing on his ranch. And so, that's the same desert that they've ranched for 150 years that is now coming back to life. So these principles are pretty universal. We've seen this evidence all over the world. So the biological carpet is just to protect the soil, microorganisms from ultraviolet light so that life can start growing. Now, when in the 30 years of experiments, if I made the biological carpet too thick, we had to wait a couple of years for it to break down. It was too rich. If we made it too thin, the sunlight got through, the UV got through. So there is kind of a sweet spot, so it's not something that you can do without experience, but I encourage everyone to experiment for themselves and figure out where that sweet spot is.
So you've mentioned the importance of fungi. So fungi are often neglected and misunderstood in farming, ranching, and ecological restoration. What special role do fungi play in the process of turning deserts into grasslands?
So when I was in school, we had the plant and the animal kingdom. We didn't even know fungi existed. And when I was in college, we still had the plant and the animal kingdom. And now we at least admit that there's the plant, animal, and fungi kingdom. But our knowledge base of it is extremely limited. Now, my excitement with the fungi kingdom is we all know that fungi rot things. And we all know that to have a life cycle, you've got to have birth, growth, death, and decay. Well, decay, well, that's the fungi's role. What we didn't realize was that birth is also the fungi's role. So if the fungi are not sending out messages to plants to germinate and start growing, the birth doesn't even begin. So we can't have decay and we can't have birth without fungi. Now, we kind of know that, but we don't know that. So if you buy legume seeds as a crop farmer, it's quote unquote inoculated.
Mm.
All that means is we've put fungi with it. So we do know it, but we don't connect the dots. But it's not just fungi seed. It's all the seeds kind of require the fungi connection. So for me, I'm around 50 years old now. For me, I've gone from fungi to no, concentrate on the fungi. If we get the fungi right, even though we can't see the things, when we get the mycelial networks right, I keep observing that we get the fungi first, and then we see things come right. Now, where this was first demonstrated to me was one of the first biological carpets that I did really successfully, that really shook me as a researcher, was in Zimbabwe. We put down the biological carpet, and about 2 weeks later, the first rains came. And it was just fascinating to watch, because the first thing that happened was dung beetles buried all the dung. And then the second thing that happened was a carpet of different fungi, fruit heads, fruiting bodies came up. Now, when I say a carpet, I didn't know much about fungi at the time, so I didn't research them, I didn't tabulate them, I didn't do anything. But in my mind's eye, if I had to guess how many different species of fungi germinated on this one biological carpet, I would guess it was over 1,000 different species. There were little blue ones, little pink ones, yellow ones, there were big white ones, there were brown ones. It was just the sea of fungi. And then the fungi all shriveled, wilted, and they were done. And then about 10 days from 10 days after the rain, then it turned into a chia pet of fresh new forage, germinating and growing. And then 6 weeks later, the village women in the area, they started yelling and screaming, and they were all excited because a grass that they hadn't seen since they were children was suddenly there, visible, and available. So that was kind of the first, and that was 15 now. So that was about 20 years ago. That was the first time I saw this absolutely distinct, undeniable connection between fungi and then the grasses starting to germinate. So that's when I started to concentrate on it and pay attention.
So fungi are not just involved in decay, but also birth or the emergence of plants.
Yes, I'm absolutely convinced that fungi are both the signal for birth and the instigators of decay, and probably growth, and probably growth as well. Birth, growth, death.
Sure,
and decay.
And fungi help plants utilize nutrients more efficiently. We know that.
Yeah.
And they help communication between plants and delivery of nutrients and water.
Yeah, well, you say that. So there's one fungi that's known about that pumps water from like 90 feet down back up to the surface to trade it with plants for sugars. So I think, I really believe fungi hold the planet together.
Right.
And I think we've ignored them for far too long.
They, in a sense, they look like plants to our untrained eyes, but they also, they're the reverse of the oxygen and carbon dioxide cycle. Plants take in the oxygen and put out carbon dioxide. Fungi, just like animals, they take in oxygen and give out carbon dioxide. So you can see how they would have a special role to play in places where animals can't.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
We talk a lot about the global climate, but you also emphasize microclimates. What is a microclimate and how does it work?
Yeah, when we were in school, we all learned about the water cycle. You know, the water evaporates off the ocean, blows over the mountains, falls, and goes back into the streams and back to the ocean. Well, we didn't describe that hot wind causing it to evaporate, so it actually doesn't get to fall, et cetera, et cetera. But a long time ago, I realized that there was a micro water cycle that was more important than the macro water cycle. And the micro water cycle is moisture stored in plants, it's moisture stored in fungi, it's the spores from fungi causing rain drops to actually be created. It's the evapotranspiration from plants. It's the it's you know, it can literally be this water within millimeters of the soil to centimeters from the soil to higher, but it creates its own weather pattern. And there were two areas around the world, one in South Africa and one in the United States, where the research showed when they planted more plants, the actual precipitation increased. So what I noticed as we were turning the deserts back into grasslands, we noticed that it hasn't rained for 6 weeks, but there's still dew on the ground. How's that possible? That's the micro water cycle that you're seeing in evidence. You know, when there's a rainfall event and you've got bare soil and 85% of the rain evaporates, often within as little as half an hour of the precipitation event, that vapor, where's that vapor gone? You know, that vapor, you know, either dissipates back into the atmosphere or it's absorbed into the micro water cycle. When I was in the deserts of the Middle East, I found a lot of plants that were catching the dew overnight, and then the dew was funneling down the leaves. And then I dug down, and about a meter underground, I found a little ball of fungi that was holding and trapping a ball of water. So the fungi was holding the water against the root of the plant that had been captured from dew. Well, that's the micro water cycle. And I think it's a far more important cycle, and one that most scientists and definitely all school teachers are blissfully unaware of. And I think we need to pay attention to it, because I honestly believe the reason 2/3 of the desert of the planet has turned to desert is because we didn't understand just how vital the micro water cycle is. So what I have learned about the micro water cycle, we have to protect the top of the soil surface from ultraviolet light and heat, and we have to ensure that we've got a healthy fungal network. And with those two things, that triggers healthy plants, and then we can maintain a healthy micro water cycle.
If that's true, then there's a whole lot more we can do locally about climate. We don't have to blame our ecological degradation or droughts and floods on what's going on way out there or way up there. We can say, the plant matter matters, the ecosystem matters, what's on the ground and in the ground matters for the climate.
We will never solve climate change until we solve the micro water cycle. The two are hand in hand, and droughts and floods are symptoms of non-functioning micro water cycles.
Right, and in the climate media that I've seen, there, whenever you have a flood or a drought, it is blamed on the global climate, instead of acknowledging that much of flooding has to do with what we've done to the land, and much of drought and desertification has to do with what we've done to the land locally and regionally, irrespective of the total carbon content of the atmosphere, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I'd caution you to even use the words "what we've done to the land." No, what we've done to the micro water cycle.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
Got it.
we've destroyed the micro water cycle, which
And
you
you're
see
describing the
on.
micro water cycle as, it not only happens locally, but it happens within organisms and within
Yeah,
communities and within these tiny ecosystems that might exist in a log or under the ground, et cetera.
exactly.
So back to Southern California, you're proposing, and what you propose to do with the turning desert into grasslands, you're proposing that people invest in a business enterprise with the expectation of making a profit. In other words, a cattle business and a land restoration business. How does that work, and what is the business model?
Well, firstly, I will be able to tell you everything you need to know about cows and excuse my French, shit. But when it comes to the business model for the rest of the industry, I need to admit I'm out of my depth. While all my friends were studying to be lawyers and accountants and bankers, I was studying in the bush. So I could upskill myself and teach myself all of that stuff, but to be quite honest, I don't want to bother. I more want to attract people who want to save the climate,
Mhm.
to get involved. Now, having said that, as a dumb cowboy, I will tell you that if you've got a piece of desert land and you turn it into a functioning grassland with flowing rivers and everything like that, uh, just human nature, it has to go up in value.
Mhm.
So let's say you buy uh, um, 500 acres for $1 million. Yeah, that's $2,000 an acre, and you put a 1 acre of that 500 acres. You put a house on that, a very nice house, but now it's surrounded with 500 acres of lovely, pristine grassland, with shrubs and deer and elk and pronghorn and quail. I'm not sure, but I think, 2 hours from Los Angeles, nice warm climate like that, able to keep your horses and stuff. I'm not sure, but I think that property would probably become worth about $10 million without blinking.
Mm.
So that's one aspect. The other aspect is your average price that you buy steers at the market is anywhere between $800 and $1,200 per head. Let's round that off and say $1,000 per head. Well, if you look at Cargill and JBS, their average retail price for an animal after it's been through a feedlot is between $8,000 and $8,600 per head. So you've got the increase in value because instead of doing a feedlot based on corn, we would be doing a biodiverse grass feeding program. So you would have the increase in value because you've now got a lot of grass-fed animals that are ready for the local market, and you've taken a light steer and turned it into a heavy steer. So you've got the weight gain that's increased in value. And if we just use the current market figures, you've taken a product from $1,000 to $8,000. I think that there's a little bit of a profit margin in there, even if we do it badly.
Mm. Mm.
I mean, even if we do it badly, but more importantly, now instead of shipping that beef from Texas
Mhm.
all the way to California, you've got Brawley is 30 minutes drive away, and Los Angeles is 2 hours drive away. So you've now got a locally produced, healthy meat product that instead of coming from a CAFO where it's pollution and animal cruelty and all those horrible things. I mean, we just had 10,000 black cattle die in Kansas. Instead of going from that, horrible model, now you've got animals out in the desert on pasture under shade with chickens, and they're moving forward each day, and they've got unlimited grazing and unlimited water, and they're living their best life, and they're 2 hours away. I think the story is a better story. I think the product will be a better product, and I think the profit margins would probably be higher. But there are so many different ways to fund a company? Do you do an IPO? Do you do, there's all this language, there's all this jargon of the people in the financial industry that they don't understand my jargon about dung and urine and microorganisms. And to quite frankly, I don't really understand their jargon. But I'm sure that just as a dumb cowboy, I think these figures work. And so I'm talking to various groups and people to see what would be the best way forward. Because just on a thumb suck, if we do get to 150,000 acres a year and 700,000 cattle, you don't have to be too smart to see that it's quite it's quite a large business that it grows into very quickly. I'm just going to pull out a calculator quickly and go, okay, let's say we've got 700,000 and we multiply it by 8,000. Now, no, there's no costs in that, but that's a $5.6 billion a year business. There might be some profit in that.
Yeah, might be some.
Yeah, billion, who knows? It all depends on how well we run the operation, but I believe it should be highly profitable. And so I think investors would like to be involved in something that is profitable, solving global climate change, creating beautiful wildlife habitat, creating employment for people for the next 100 years, cooling the soil, cooling the air going into Los Angeles. I mean, what's the downside?
That's what I say.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll speed things up and we'll get to the talking to the people who have money, so we can figure out the best way to get it done.
And then when you restore land, it's natural that wildlife will return. And you may agree with me that I think we've been taught that wildlife and people are kind of two separate things, and they're always going to be antagonistic, or they're always going to displace each other. I'm of the opinion that we could have abundant wildlife and have people living in abundance as well. So in that regard, what are some of the more impressive things you've seen in terms of the return of wildlife to an area that was degraded and has been restored?
Well, obviously, the ranch I managed for the Africa Center for Holistic Management in Zimbabwe, that takes the cake. So we went from 5,000 acres of severely desertified land. Our first year, we borrowed 60 head of cattle, and we could barely find food for 60 head of cattle on 5,000 acres. The next year, we jumped to 350 cattle and then 600 cattle. And the year after, over 2,000 wild Cape buffalo joined us, over 500 elephants. Who knows how many impala, kudu, sable, waterbuck, you name it. But basically, lions. The lion researchers from Wangi National Park, which is 350 square miles, said that there were more lions on Deepangombe, 5,000 acres, than there were in Wangi National Park, because when all the wildlife left the national park to come and graze our forage, which we wanted them to do, the predators had to follow them. So that is hands down the most impressive. Now, Deepangombe has incredible wildlife numbers in the dry season, and in the wet season, you won't find any game. Primarily, because it dissipates, it spreads out again, and also because we would chase it off if we saw it, because we want the forage to grow in the wet season. So that's the best. But ranches in the Chihuahuan Desert in Mexico have gone from bare soil for as far as the eye could see to big herds of deer and bear and turkeys, and it doesn't matter where in the world we do this. There's the principle and a saying I came up with many years ago is life begets life. More life begets more life. And we really have to understand that it's all connected. As you get more photosynthesis happening, well, there's more food. As there's more food, well, now there's more, the food is animals, more bacteria, more nematodes, more earthworms, more ground birds, more everything. So we've never had people start managing holistically and healing deserts where we didn't end up with significantly more animals. Now, in Africa, I had lions, leopards, cheetah, civet, serval, jackal, probably a couple of others. But I mean, I had so many predators. And I would like to say we didn't lose any animals to predators, but that's not true. We once lost about 5 lambs to a hyena who had no teeth. And so she was desperate and took the risk. But you can run huge herds of livestock with packs of wolves, with bear, with lions, leopards, cheetah. Does your management change? Absolutely. But can we figure out how to all get along? Absolutely.
So, I hear you saying that we can grow food under circumstances that actually create more space, more habitat for wildlife, and that's why they come, as opposed to seeing the wildlife as the enemy or a threat, as opposed to seeing if it's a carnivore, then it's a threat to your herd,
Yeah, we've got a good example of how we've got to manage. So in California, they outlawed shooting cougars, mountain lions, because they're pretty kiddies. The problem was they forgot that cougars have 8 or 9 kittens. Now, so the population went from 1 cougar to 8 to 64. 64, you see how quickly the numbers increased.
Right.
Now, deer only have 1 fawn per year. So deer went from 1 to 1 to 2. Only problem was there were now 64, 1,000, 3,000 cougars all trying to eat that 1 deer fawn. And the deer populations have absolutely plummeted because we weren't managing the entire ecosystem. We tried to pick a favorite because it was cute. And that was foolish. However, and people say, well, what about those desert species? If we turn it all back into grassland, what will they do? Well, you have to back off and think about it. Those desert species have existed for millions of years. Now, we know historically these areas were grasslands. So those desert species that now cover the whole desert, they were living when it wasn't a desert. The difference is now they're eking out an existence in the desert, but if the desert ecosystem becomes more abundant, now they're not eking out an existence. So for example, a horny toad might now be in the flat land looking for food. But if there's dung beetles and grasshoppers and everything everywhere, his habitat goes from the flat land desperately looking for food to now the rock in the middle of the grass is where he sits, and he sits on the rock and all this food comes to him. So the horny toad is still there. It's just his niche within the desert changes. The rattlesnake is still there, except now he has abundant mice to feed on. All the desert species are still there. They just have a better ecosystem in which to survive. Doing this is not going to make things worse for the desert species. It's going to make it better for the desert species.
And the radical notion in this that many people are not aware of is that if you rotate your grazing animals properly, then it has a regenerative effect.
Well, yes. So the first step is the biological carpet to trigger life to start growing. Once the biological carpet is established, then phase 2, which is those, call it 500-acre ranchettes, for want of a better methodology, Phase 2 is, okay, this was grassland. Humans turned it to a desert. We've now turned it back to a grassland. What do we need to do to prevent it returning to a desert? Now, in holistic management, we have examples of ranches that were fixed, that management ownership changed on, and they reverted to deserts. So we know that this can happen. Once you change management, you have to then maintain the brittle environment ecosystem. So you go from a kind of a portable feedlot operation with young animals that you're feeding up to sell into the cities, and then you morph it once you've got grassland and legumes and shrubs growing. Then you morph it into a maintenance herd, which is your breeding cows. And the maintenance herds will obviously start small and then will be allowed to just keep breeding up and breeding up. And figures we've got from a project that was proposed for Australia showed that a $30 million investment in a cattle herd over a 20-year period, just with exponential growth, with one cow, 7 years later, there's two. So, exponential growth. A $30 million investment in cattle grew to over $1 billion in a 20-year period. So people don't understand. It's fascinating to look at the graphs. It's kind of flat, and then at year 7 it starts to go up, and then it goes up and up and up and up till it's going vertically. So the future people, and that's why our project is Deserts to Grasslands, feeding the future. Because step 1 is to turn the desert into grassland using livestock. Step 2 is to feed the future population of the world by having these herds keep growing exponentially to support humanity well into the future. I'm talking 1, 2, 3, 400 years into the future. So 2 parts of the program.
And so one effect of this restoration process, one effect of holistic management, is to cool the desert. And you're saying that that could have a positive impact on the climate of Los Angeles and San Diego by mitigating some of the heat extremes, tempering some of the heat extremes. So Los Angeles has recently appointed a woman named Marta Segura as the chief heat officer. The role of the chief heat officer is to respond to heat emergencies and also to prevent heat emergencies. What would you like to tell Marta Segura?
We have a solution. Come and talk to me. I mean, literally, we have a solution. And let's say that Los Angeles has 10 million people in. I think that's a thumbsuck that I've heard thrown around. So let's say this. So I need, just to get a well-financed pilot project going, I need $100 million. And then I divide it by 10 million people, and we have a grand total of $10 each. I mean, it's literally ludicrous to think that for the cost of a hamburger, we could launch this project. We could show its success on the first 5,000 acres. The government of California controls the other 1.5 million acres we need to work on. It would make a profit the entire time, and it would get going. But it's this fear of the unknown is generally what prevents humans making change, except for when they're desperate. I personally hope that Los Angeles is getting desperate enough that they're willing to talk to a what do we call people like me, a fraud, a quack, someone who's proposing something that just sounds ridiculous. But we've been doing this for, in my life, at least 30 years successfully around the world, and it's doable. It's financially viable. For as little as $10 citizens of Los Angeles, we could launch a pilot on 5,000 acres or 6,000 acres, show people, and the scientists would be part of the team, come and measure the temperatures off the ground, come and see what happens after the first rainfall, convince people on a large enough a pilot that, okay, we want to go from 5,000 up to 150,000. Probably wouldn't even need to put any more money in, because by that time, all the investors would want to climb on board. So what I would tell to the heat czar is, please come and talk to me. I'm not frightening. I don't bite. And we actually can solve this problem for the long term.
So you have a solution, but it would require.
I can hear you again.
Okay.
Yep.
So you have a solution, but it would require looking in different places from where many people are looking today.
Yes. Look, it's so frustrating to me. Like I said, all my friends became bankers, lawyers, accountants, etc., etc. Everybody that I know prays at the God of technology, at the feet of the God of technology. I'm sorry, but technology cannot solve this. This is a natural system process. This is understanding nature. This is understanding gravity. If you drop a rock in New York City, it hits the ground. If you drop a rock in Los Angeles, it hits the ground. People can grasp that concept. The same applies. Plants in New York create oxygen. Plants in California create oxygen. It's a universal principle. Ground cover on soil cools the ground. In New York, ground cover on the ground in California cools the ground. These are universal principles. We're not doing anything clever. All we're doing is using the holistic management decision-making framework to analyze a problem and come up with a potential solution. We've been doing it for a lot of years around the world, and there's several million acres under holistic management globally, and everyone is reporting the same results. I just, because of the X Prize, decided to say, how can we push this envelope right to the far end and reverse engineer a project that can offer hope to humanity? And I think if we can convince the czar from Los Angeles, then that publicity will then impact the people in Dubai. Will say we can do it. The people in Egypt will say we can do it. The people in the outback of Australia will say we can do it. And then we have actually begun to impact global climate change. That's the message we've got to get out. Covered ground is cooler than bare ground. How do we get ground covered and make money doing it, and support communities, and feed the future of humanity? We've already got 1 billion hungry souls on the planet. In 20 years now, I've been doing this for 5 years. In 20 years' time, there will be another billion hungry souls on the planet. That's 2 billion. The one thing that causes war and conflict is hungry people. We've got 5 million hungry people who've crossed into America in the last year. You don't think they're coming here because they wanted to leave home because they were comfortable at home.
Right.
No, they were desperate for resources, and they perceive that America's got the resources. We already have 800 million acres of desert in America. The US Department of Agriculture tells us that 200 more million acres are going to be desert within 20 years. That will be 1 billion acres of desert. Our project can turn 150,000 acres per city per year from desert back into grassland. So, it'll be a tiny pinprick, but if we get going, now the other thing about this is when we turn deserts back into grasslands, we can stop deforesting, because currently we deforest to grow grass to feed cows. How about we get the cows into the deserts and let the forests stay as forests? more global climate change assistance. So that's why I persevere. I hope uncommon common sense can prevail.
And we can move forward on this with a minimal investment.
Yes, literally a minimal investment.
How can people follow you? And
so the project's website is fixdeserts.com. You can put a plural or a singular, they both work, or you can get really complicated and d2gftf.com. But Fixed Deserts rolls off the tongue a bit easier. And on our website, we have a contact sheet where we're trying to find people who are interested who can assist us. So that's probably the best site for this project, just to keep all the information in one place.
Well, thanks so much for joining me. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Rodger Savory. To learn more, go to fixdeserts.com. I've been a climate reporter for 4 years. I just recorded episode 348 of the Climate Report. I've read all of the Green New Deals. I've read the local clean and renewable energy resolutions. I'm keeping up with the legislation that's coming out of Congress that promises to spend $350 billion on technological solutions. And I agree with Rodger Savory that we're not dealing with a technological problem. We're not dealing with a deficit of technology. The deficit lies with our understanding of nature and our willingness to work with nature to solve problems like climate change, like the decline in biodiversity. We are in our infancy in understanding soil. All of the components of the soil food web, the bacteria, the protozoa, the fungi, the nematodes, the microarthropods, and how they work with plants and animals to create ecosystems and functioning water cycles and cool microclimates. We're in our infancy in understanding these things, but we know plenty to get started. We know plenty to cover the ground with plants, to take deserts and turn them into grasslands. And it's like Rodger Savory said, covered ground covered with plants is always cooler than bare ground. We know enough to get started. Rodger's initiative is called Deserts to Grasslands, Feed the Future. That says it all. We need to take deserts and turn it into grasslands so we can feed the future, so we can feed humans and we can feed nature. If we feed nature, nature will feed us. It's a great deal. So go to fixdeserts.com. Thank you and have a nice day.